Hi guys, this is Mrs. Allison. We are going to do a quick review of solving by factoring. Now this is something you should have done in Algebra 1 for sure, and then would have seen it again in geometry with different applications. So let's go through a few steps of solve by factoring. Well, the first step in order to solve by factoring is to set the equation equal to 0. Okay, so when we set the equation equal to 0, we want to make sure of one thing. And the one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is it is much easier if we can keep the x squared term, whatever it happens to be, keep it positive. Then we don't have to factor out a negative when we go to factor, which brings me to step number 2. Step number 2 is to factor the polynomial completely. Now, yesterday you looked at some factoring review, and just to keep in mind some of the factoring techniques that we have. So when we talk about factoring, one of the first things that you should always look for is a greatest common factor. Doesn't matter what type of factoring you're doing, what you're doing it for, always look for a greatest common factor. The next thing that you can look for are trinomials. A trinomial is in the form, and probably the most common form of factoring, ax squared plus bx plus c. You may see the difference of squares. So the difference of two perfect squares. We're going to abbreviate that. There's other factoring you could see, such as grouping or dealing with cubic polynomials, but these are the primary ones that you're going to see, so we're going to stick with those three. The third and final step that we have is to solve using the zero product property. The zero product property says this, and this is just the general form. If you have two terms that are multiplied together and their answer is 0, meaning you have 0 for the product, because product is the answer of a multiplication, then either A has to equal 0, or B has to equal 0, or they both have to equal 0. That's the zero product property. Okay, let's look at what that looks like. Here is our first example, and if we remember our steps, the first thing that I need to do is to set the equation equal to 0. And if you remember, we said that the best thing to do was to keep the x squared term positive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the 8x to the other side. I'm also going to move the 6 to the other side. And so when I write this polynomial, we get x squared minus 5x minus 6 equals 0. Now I need to factor completely. So the first thing I'm going to look for is any greatest common factor, and I do not have a greatest common factor. And then I'm going to see that this is a trinomial, so I'm going to be looking for two numbers that multiply to -6, and those same two numbers add to -5. So I know to multiply to -6 but add to -5, I need to have a positive and a negative, and my numbers are going to be -6 and +1. So x minus 6, x plus 1 equals 0. Now, what's important to remember is this is the factored form. So when we see it in the parentheses, this is factored form. Now, to go through and use the zero product property, what we do is this says that my A term needs to equal 0, so x minus 6 needs to equal 0, or my B term needs to equal, so x plus 1 needs to equal 0, or they both equal 0. So now I finish solving each of these, and we get x equals 6 and x equals -1. Now these right here are my solutions. So my factor and my solutions look different. Okay, factors have parentheses, solutions are in x equals. That is solve by factoring. Hit pause and try this next one. All right, hopefully you had a chance to look at this. Now, the first step is already taken care of. It is already equal to 0, and the x squared term's positive, so we've taken care of the whole first step. The second step is to factor completely. Now, if I go through my checklist, this is one of the hardest, easy questions there is, because people tend to forget this method of factoring, and that's why we star it. But my factoring technique that I'm going to use is pulling out a greatest common factor. If you'll notice that both of these terms have a 3x in them, I can factor out a 3x, and what I'm left with is x minus 1. So if I were to redistribute my 3x into x and my 3x into negative 1, I'd end up with 3x squared minus 3x. This is called factoring greatest common factor. Now, I factored it as much as I can. So my next step is to use the zero product property, which says that either 3x needs to equal 0 or x minus 1 needs to equal 0, or they both equal 0 at the same time. And if I divide both sides by 3, we get x equals 0. And if I add 1 to both sides, we get x equals 1. So my two possible solutions that both make this equation true are x equals 0 and x equals 1. These are my solutions. So this is my factored form. My factored form is 3x times x minus 1. My solutions are x equals 0, x equals 1. If you ever want to check your work, it's very easy to take what x equals and substitute it back into the equation. 3 times 0 squared minus 3 times 0 equals 0. And see if it makes a true statement. Here we get 3 times 0 squared is 0, minus 3 times 0, which is 0. So 0 minus 0 equals 0. Works. X equals 1. 3 times 1 squared minus 3 times 1. So we get 3 minus 3, which means 0 equals 0. So I know my solutions work because I can check it. All right, let's try a word problem. Okay, so you see this problem here. You are making a rectangular table. The area of the table is going to be 10 feet squared. How do we find area? We know that area of a rectangle equals the length times the width. This says you want the length of the table to be 1 foot shorter than twice the width. Well, let's call this W for the width. Then the length of the table is going to be 1 foot shorter than twice the width. Well, twice the width would be 2W minus 1 to represent the 1 foot shorter. Now, I can fill in the information that I know. I know that the length is 2W minus 1, and the width is W, and the area is 10. Now, here's the problem. I don't know anything about a 10 product property, but I do know 0 product property. So I need to set this equation equal to 0, which means I need to distribute my W in here first before I can set it equal to 0. So we get 10 equals 2W squared minus 1W. Close, but now I need to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 10 because we want to keep our W squared term positive. So we get 0 equals 2W squared minus 1W minus 10. So in my steps of solving by factoring, I've set it equal to 0 and kept the x squared term positive. Now I need to factor completely. Well, this happens to not have a greatest common factor. It does happen to be a trinomial where a is greater than 1. Now, if you like the X box, use the X box method. If you can use guess and check, use guess and check. I think on this one, guess and check works really well because the only two options that could be in the front of the parenthesis are 2W and W. And if I need to multiply to 10, but add to 1, I'm going to multiply this 2w by 2 and the w by 5 so that I get 10 total, but I need one of them to be negative, and I want the 5 to be negative, and I'll show you why. If we were to check our work real quick, just to verify this is the factored form, we would get 2w squared plus 4w minus 5w minus 10. Minus 10. So we know this is the correct factoring. And now what I'm going to do is I'm on my third step, so I've factored completely, and now I'm going to use the zero product property. So 2w minus 5 equals 0, and w plus 2 equals 0, which means 2w equals 5, and here w equals 5 halves. And subtracting 2 here, we get w equals negative 2. Well, we're talking about dimensions of a table, and there's no way the width could be negative 2. You can't have a dimension of negative 2. So we know the width is 5 halves, or 2.5. And if I take this w equals 5 halves and substitute it in, because we need to find the dimensions of the table, we know that 2 times 5 halves minus 1 equals the length. So we would get 5 minus 1, so the length is 4. So my dimensions of my table are the width equals 5 halves, or 2.5. You could write it either way. And these are feet. And the length equals 4 feet. And that's how you solve by factoring.